Imagine spending your entire life clawing back a kingdom that everyone said you'd already lost, surviving betrayal, exile, war, and humiliation, only to die completely alone, jaw rotting from the inside, starving to death because you physically cannot swallow food. That was the end of Charles VII of France. Not on a battlefield, not from an assassin's blade. He starved, slowly, painfully, conscious until nearly the very end. And the worst part, his own son let it happen. If you're new here, welcome to the Forgotten Throne, where we dig up the royal stories history textbooks buried. Hit subscribe right now, because what I'm about to tell you is one of the most jaw-dropping falls from power you've never heard of. Let's get into it. Charles VII was never supposed to be king, not even close. He was the 11th child of King Charles VI, a man history remembers as Charles the Mad, a ruler so far gone mentally that he genuinely believed he was made of glass, and that if someone touched him wrong, he would shatter into 1,000 pieces. That was the father. That was the legacy Charles VII was born into. With 10 siblings ahead of him in the royal bloodline, young Charles was essentially invisible, a spare of a spare of a spare. But one by one, his older brothers, each one officially named heir to the French throne, died before they could ever wear the crown. And suddenly, this forgotten 11th child was the last man standing. His inheritance? A kingdom on fire. England's King Henry V was shredding through France like it was paper. The Duke of Burgundy, a brutal warlord named John the Fearless, had seized Paris. Charles' own father was too lost in his delusions to do anything about it. At barely 17 years old, Charles was forced to flee the capital and set up a makeshift royal court in the city of Bourges. Far from Paris, far from power, and dangerously close to irrelevance. People started mocking him openly. They called him the King of Bourges because that's all he seemed to rule, a single city, while the English and Burgundians carved up the rest of France between them. But here's the thing about Charles VII that people get wrong. They underestimate him. He may have looked weak, he may have played the part of a frightened young prince, but underneath that performance was a mind that was already calculating, already dangerous. John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy, who had taken Paris and made Charles's life a living nightmare, agreed to meet the young Dauphin on a bridge to negotiate peace. The Duke showed up with a small escort, completely confident that he had Charles right where he wanted him. Charles had other plans. He brought an army. John the Fearless walked onto that bridge, thinking he was meeting a desperate teenager. Instead, he walked straight into a slaughter. Charles's men cut down the Duke and his entire entourage on the spot. The most feared nobleman in France, dead on a bridge in the middle of nowhere, because Charles had simply outthought him. It was ruthless, it was cold-blooded, and it worked. But it also created a new enemy. John's son, Philip the Good, swore revenge, and he meant it. And then came the stab in the back that Charles never saw coming, and it came from his own father. Charles VI, mentally broken and completely manipulated by English diplomats, signed the Treaty of Troyes. In one stroke of a pen, the Mad King disinherited his own son and declared England's Henry V the rightful heir to the French throne. The entire French nation was furious, but Charles VII was shattered. His father, who barely recognized his own reflection most days, had just handed his birthright to the enemy. And to make it worse, Henry V was an absolute military genius. Charles knew he couldn't beat him on the battlefield, so he did the smart thing. He retreated south, sheltered under the protection of the powerful Yolande of Aragon, and waited. He married Yolanda's daughter, Marie of Anjou. He built alliances. He held on. When and then fate intervened. Henry V, conqueror of France, unbeatable in battle, the man who seemed destined to rule 2 kingdoms, died suddenly. Not in combat, not from a wound, just gone. And Charles VI followed him to the grave weeks later. Just like that, Charles VII's greatest obstacles were in the ground. The English king's heir was a literal infant. Charles finally had a fighting chance, but he almost threw it all away. For years after that, Charles VII accomplished almost nothing. He couldn't take back Paris. He couldn't push the English north. He grew depressed, withdrawn, and at his absolute lowest point, he seriously considered abandoning France entirely, packing up and fleeing to Spain, leaving his entire kingdom to the English forever. France would not exist today if he had done it. And then a teenage peasant girl showed up at a military garrison in a backwater village, grabbed the commanding officer, and told him that God had personally sent her to save France and put Charles on the throne. Her name was Joan of Arc. Charles didn't trust her, obviously, because he wasn't stupid, and plenty of lunatics claimed to have divine visions. So he ran a test. When Joan arrived at court, Charles disguised himself as an ordinary courtier and hid among his own men. Joan walked into that room and went straight to him. No hesitation, no searching. She looked through the crowd, found the man hiding in plain sight, knelt at his feet, and called him her king. Charles was shaken to his core. He later admitted she told him things about his private thoughts, things he had never spoken aloud to anyone. Whether you believe in miracles or not, that moment changed everything. He handed Joan command of his armies. What followed was nothing short of extraordinary. In just a few months, Joan of Arc turned a losing war completely around. She led French forces to victory after victory. She broke sieges that had dragged on for years. She did what Charles's generals couldn't do in decades of fighting. In 1429, Charles VII was officially and formally crowned King of France. The King of Bourges had become the King of France. Eventually, Joan was captured by Charles's enemies and handed over to the English. They burned her at the stake for heresy. Charles did almost nothing to save her, a fact that still haunts his legacy to this day. Joan gets most of the credit for putting him on the throne, but it was Yolande of Aragon's money and political genius that actually funded the whole operation. By now, Charles VII had proven himself a genuine king. He pushed the English out of France, rebuilt his shattered kingdom, and earned the title Charles the Victorious. He also became one of the most scandalous monarchs in French history. He had 14 children with his wife, Marie. And then he met Agnes Sorel. Agnes was nearly 20 years younger than Charles, and she had started out as simply a lady-in-waiting to the Queen. Charles took one look at her and immediately made her his official royal mistress, openly, shamelessly, in front of everyone. Agnes Sorel was not just beautiful, she was bold. She wore gowns so outrageously low-cut that she scandalized the entire French court. Noble women were simultaneously horrified and secretly obsessed. She set fashion trends while driving priests and moralists absolutely mad. She also had real influence over Charles. His decisions, his policies, his mood. Agnes shaped all of it. In addition to his 14 children with Marie, Charles fathered 3 more with Agnes. But in 1450, Agnes made the brutal mistake of traveling across France in the dead of winter while pregnant, just to be near Charles during a military campaign. She fell violently ill. She gave birth to the child, but neither she nor the baby survived. Modern forensic scientists who examined the case in 2005 found extreme levels of mercury in her remains, enough to suggest deliberate poisoning. The prime suspect? Charles's own son, Louis. Louis was the Dauphin, Charles's heir and the person most impatient to inherit the crown. He loathed Agnes Sorel with every fiber of his being. He despised his father. He spent years plotting against the king, turning nobles against him, quietly working to undermine the throne from the inside. Charles eventually banished Louis to southern France, but that only made things worse. Louis recruited a spy and put her right in Charles's bed. After Agnes died, Charles, barely pausing to grieve, took Agnes's own 16-year-old cousin, Antoinette de Menly, as his new mistress. She was young, she was beautiful, and she was completely in Louis's pocket. She reported everything to the Dauphin, every conversation, every plan, every weakness. Charles was being watched by the person sleeping next to him, orchestrated by the son he had already banished. In 1458, a sore appeared on Charles's leg. Just a small wound, easy to dismiss, but it didn't heal. Instead, it spread. It infected. It brought fevers that wouldn't break. And over the next 2 agonizing years, it slowly consumed him from the inside out. The infection eventually reached his jaw. An abscess formed, massive, grotesque, growing until it filled his entire lower face. His jaw swelled so severely that in his final days, Charles the Victorious The man who had reclaimed France from the English, the man who had survived betrayal, exile, and political assassination, could not swallow food. He could not swallow water. He was conscious, he was aware, and he was starving to death 1 hour at a time. In his final days, his mind fractured under the suffering, and he raved about traitors surrounding him. He begged for his son to come. Louis never came. The Dauphin sat in the north and waited, cold, patient, unmoved. He refused to visit his dying father, refused to offer any comfort, any reconciliation, any final mercy. He simply waited for the news that Charles was dead so he could take the throne. Charles VII died in 1461, not in battle, not peacefully in his sleep, but starving, jaw-rotting, abandoned by his heir, raving about the son who had spent a lifetime trying to destroy him. He went from the forgotten 11th child of a madman to the king who saved France. And his reward was one of the most horrific deaths in the entire history of the French monarchy. Charles VII conquered enemies, outlasted legends, and rebuilt a broken kingdom. But he couldn't survive his own family. History remembers Joan of Arc. History remembers Henry V. Barely anyone remembers the complicated, ruthless, brilliant, heartbroken king who ended his days starving on a deathbed while his son counted the minutes. Now you know. If this story hit different, drop a comment below. I want to know what shocked you most. And if you want more stories about the kings and queens history forgot, subscribe to The Forgotten Throne. New video drops soon, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. The crown never protects you from the people closest to it.